Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on a couple of my European nightcrawler worm bins. And there's some information about them here on the board if you're interested in knowing the details. But basically, there's two pairs of European nightcrawler worm bins. The other pair are the ones that I consider as my somewhat older ones that are nearing harvest. And these are the younger ones which are still under 200 days of age. I think they've still got quite a way to go before we're going to try to bring them to their end. And the one thing that sets these European nightcrawler bins apart from all the other systems in my wormery is that there's a little bit of a test going on here. Down in bin number one, we're attempting to compost a bag that had been labeled as compostable. Kind of a produce bag, a very thin plasticky material that was labeled as compostable. And even though the test itself started nearly 400 days ago, at this point, I think 2 weeks from now, we're going to be hitting the point where the actual active composting of that bag will have reached 1 year in active composting duty. And my reason for having this little piece of carton here was so that we can start by extracting the compostable bag, kind of get it out of our way and make sure we avoid damaging it, because when I'm doing little tests like this to see how things break down in the worm bin, it is my preference to see only the worm bin contributing to its breakdown. So in other words, I won't be tearing it away or I won't be crumbling stuff up that are in that sort of test mode. So we've been taking efforts to not interfere with the breakdown process, or I guess by interfere I just mean we've been careful not to help with the process. And as I recall, the bag was, oh boy, right down here near where the feeding zone is. It seems like these worms have done quite a number on these pieces of top covering cardboard I had laid out here. One of the types of cardboard was the sort of kind of cardboard box, like something that you would buy crackers or cakes or cereal in, and this is more of the corrugated type cardboard, the multi-layer with the wavy stuff in between the layers. And this piece of single layer cardboard over here is even further along than the other half of it, because previously this had still been holding together as a single piece, kind of like what we're seeing here. We had been intentionally trying to position these two top covering cardboard top coverings where the corrugated one would be underneath in this case and it would be on top in this case. So I actually thought that maybe today what we could do was put this cardboard to somewhat better use than just top covering material. I thought that perhaps we can assign it to a somewhat more noble mission here in the worm bins by actually adding it to the feeding zones as supplementary bedding. And then they'd be out of our way. Here's just another little chunk of that stuff. So now, like I said, it would be kind of nice to try to dig down. Right around here is where I recall us positioning a couple of the things that we fed last time, such as banana peel and some cucumber peel, in the interest of trying to drive worm traffic towards the compostable bag. So here, I believe I'm already seeing traces of the compostable bag positioned where the banana peel had been. I believe here is part of the banana peel, and like I said earlier, I'm always kind of interested in trying to not subject the compostable bag to any rough handling on my part, but that is kind of a tricky thing to do, you know, so I'm almost kind of going at this with kit gloves. I'm even seeing a worm cocoon right over here stuck to the banana peel. It's right on the tip of my index finger there, a little worm cocoon, which is always a nice thing to see in the worm bin. So let's see about getting this compostable bag test out of our way. I guess before we put it into this little holding cup and set it aside, perhaps we could talk about it a little bit. I mean, I did hint at this last week, and it's been kind of on my mind here and there, questioning whether or not continuing with this even makes sense, considering something I mentioned last week, which was just the unusual way it's all appearing to stay together as one whole object, making me really question as to whether or not this thing's really breaking down or not, or is it just sort of a figment of our imagination. I mean, overall, as far as it being a produce bag, very similar to what was resting out on top of both of these systems as a top covering, sort of a vapor barrier, you would have to kind of admit that it does look quite a bit smaller at this point than your typical produce bag. If you can imagine the size of a produce bag, probably almost the size of, what we're seeing here. And there's a lot of moisture. There is so much moisture going on here. But now that we've got our test object out of our way, we can go at this a little bit more wholeheartedly instead of having to kind of approach it with our little pinky extended and tiptoeing around what we're doing here. Now we can really excavate the feeding zone and see what we see here. Good many European night crawlers huddled around the different stuff that was placed down here into the feeding zone as they're feeding and bedding. So I'm just sort of collecting any sort of larger leftover bedding and food bits that I encounter along the way. I'm just building a little pile of that stuff here in front of me. Something we've not done in this system for a few check-ins, I think according to my spreadsheet, I did verify that it was 3 feedings ago that we last tilled up the outer edges of these systems, and during the last 2 feedings, and even during one check-in where we just introduced some extra worms to the system that came out of my time-lapse rig, we left those outer edges of the systems untouched, and I really wanted to kind of finally give those outer edges of both systems a good aeration and tilling. And I kind of wondered if perhaps we could also stir in some of the leftover foods and whatnot that we encountered along the way. There was just the matter of these 2 somewhat larger objects, because there's going to be one of these mango seeds over in the other one in the bin number 2. So we've spent a good bit of time over here in bin number 1. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take this mango seed and just position it in here with the rest of the foods that they're going to be getting. You can see there's an assortment of different small particle sized things, and I've got a few coffee filters to include. This over here is even the avocado pit that I sliced up a little bit. I got some napkins here, or paper towels, or a combination of both, as well as some other paper towels off on the side that I'd like to also use as bedding. So to me it did seem like it was going to be a pretty generous application of bedding with today's feeding. And why are these worms all hanging out in the corner? Have these been bad boys? Have they been sent to the corner by their mommy? Kind of makes me wonder. Or could it be, something to do with the fact that we've not interfered with what's going on in the outskirts of these bins, and maybe the worms are really liking that and gravitating towards those portions of the bin that are not getting fiddled with during all my check-ins. So I think we'll pick up the pace here just so we can, number 1, retrieve the one large slow composting food item from the feeding zone of bin number 2, so that we can make sure it gets included with today's feeding. And then any other leftover bits of bedding or food we encounter down here in the feeding zone can simply, I think, you just get blended in with all the other materials. And this must be some sort of like a baked good. Some of my feedings recently have included different baked goods that were just getting dry and stale. So I'm suspecting that that's what we're seeing, some leftovers of. You know, these definitely do seem to be nice, busy bins. But now that we've extracted the test object and isolated and removed those 2 slow composting pits out of the mango seeds, I think we're in a position now to just till up and aerate both systems, and then we can move on to feeding. So let's make that happen. Let's start checking out how things in the outskirts of these systems look. The one thing that's kind of concerning me is the degree of moisture in these systems, and as much as I think the worms probably appreciate high level of moisture in their environment, I don't like the way it causes the material to clump together into these big mud balls, you know. So my thinking on that is probably, you know, I think I am going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and swap the top coverings on these systems out. As the weather warms up, since we're in spring now, the furnace in my house runs less and less. And it's usually my furnace that I blame, or, you know, maybe blame is not the right word, but I chalk up dry air in the house to the furnace, the forced hot air heat that I've got here in my house. And as the temperatures outside warm up and the need for running the heat becomes less and less over time, it does seem like the humidity in the house becomes more, and it seems like my worm bins dry out less and less because there's just ambient moisture throughout the air, and then the moisture that's in the bins don't tend to leave the way they would when the air in the house is really dry. So here and there we're still just bumping into little bits of leftover food and little bits of leftover bedding and whatnot. And the moisture everywhere is just super high, way more than it needs to be. At first I thought that perhaps we would just swap out the plastic bag coverings with another type of plastic covering that allows for a little bit more airflow underneath itself, which is bubble wrap. You know, by placing the bubbles down, you've got those gaps in between each bubble, allowing for a little bit of airflow, but I think we need more than that here. I think we just need to really let these systems air out a little bit better. So I believe the way we're going to finish off today is to just skip putting the plastic tops back on. And for that matter, I'm not even going to put these systems away. I'm going to leave them out here on the bench so that after the material that's adhering to those plastic top coverings has dried a little bit, I'll be able to shake that off and just return it to the worm bins, and then I'll be able to retire those top covering plastics. So let's see if we've got a similar moisture situation occurring down here in bin number 2. It certainly does seem that way. Perhaps not quite as severe as we saw in bin number 1, but it's tough to tell. I was even trying to use the last few check-ins, the footage I shot during those, to see if I could get a sense of how moist things were in these systems, and I really felt like I wasn't getting a good sense of it. And I think that could have been in large part due to the fact that we just didn't till around too much. We focused our energies on just taking care of the feeding and then closing up shop, never disrupting the outer edges of these systems for quite some time now. But here we are now, finally getting these outer edges tilled up and stirred around and kind of breaking that streak of non-interference in those sections of the bins. And I hope the aeration helps a little bit. It seems like it's, you know, so damp that aeration might not even help much. This one thing that I bumped into over here was the stem of a pumpkin, although now I'm just not having any luck locating it. You would think a fairly large hard object would be easy to find, and there it is, you know. Little bits and pieces of leftover food and whatnot throughout both bins. I see stems of banana, I see peels of banana. I saw that stem. And I'm not even so interested in trying to get everything that's in progress like that down into the center of the bin, although I think it's nice to be able to kind of expect where you're going to find all the food items that you've been feeding kind of down the middle. But after a good thorough stirring of the system's contents in both bins and aeration, it's not too surprising that stuff is just going to be all over at this point, which I think is kind of a good thing. So let's finally get to the business of feeding these little guys. I'm going to follow through on this idea of bringing in these bits of cardboard that had been just sort of top coverings, and I think that this one here was the one that belonged to this bin because it had not been chewed up so much as the one we had over in bin number 1. So we'll just stick to putting things back to where we found them to a certain point if we can. And yeah, here's the one that was kind of falling apart at this point. And this one wasn't so much falling apart, but I did notice a fairly distinct section of it where the worms had nibbled through it. Maybe the springtails are helping too, because I see a good number of springtails there. And like I said, I've got paper towel over here that I'd also like to include as supplementary bedding as part of today's feeding. I've got those coffee filters. Let's start piling in their feeding. Almost everything I put in my worm bins is frozen, but these avocado pits that I sliced up a little bit are not frozen. You can even see some of these napkins are still kind of factory folded and unused. No biggie. Usually I try to set stuff like that aside and at least get one actual use out of it before it turns into bedding in my worm bins, but you know what? I'm not that inclined to worry too much about it. Oops. Let's keep piling in the old stuff, and then we can go ahead and start piling in the new stuff. So yeah, good bit of food here, right? Let's see how many coffee filters I've got over here. I did put a couple of them aside so that we could use them as feeding zone indicators at the very end, which is a little tradition I like to do in my worm bins. But at this point I am starting to get this feeling like I've been drawing this feeding out perhaps a little longer than it needs to be, so I believe we should really pick up the pace and get this job completed. I mean, I did have a couple distinct things in mind for this feeding in terms of getting the compostable bag isolated and excluded from the system so we'd have free range throughout the whole system in both cases, so that we can do a good thorough aeration of both bins and make sure things in the outskirts of both bins are doing okay. And they were doing great because the worms definitely seemed to enjoy being out there in those undisturbed outer sections of both systems. But I think that the moisture level is really my main concern here in these bins. I am glad we had an opportunity to give both systems a nice aeration and tilling up, and I think it is going to be a good idea to exclude the plastic coverings at this point and let both systems kick off some of what I think is excess moisture at this point, because it feels to me like if that's not done, some of the material in these systems will just sort of get into clumps and never release from itself and just stay that way. And I'd really like for the material in my systems to flow a little bit better and not be so, you know, clumpy basically. So let's not forget we've got this test object here. I almost did forget, so I'm glad I looked over to the side to see what I forgot. I am kind of a scatterbrain sometimes, as many of you know. So the only thing we'll typically do is try to spread this thing out so that it has maximum exposure to worm traffic, and if possible, provide it with a little bit of yummy food bits on and around it so that it's going to attract worm traffic to itself because of it. And can't think of much more to be done down here. I think we're in pretty good shape, so why don't we get these feeding zones covered back up with some of this very muddy, gooey stuff, which definitely needs to dry at this point. Definitely needs to dry. Absolutely definitely needs to dry. And you know, that's going to drive the worms down. Once this top surface starts to become dry and inhospitable for worm traffic, it'll become, you know, a place where the worms will, for the most part, not even be interested in hanging out because of the dryness. They'll just go down deeper into the more damp material where they prefer to be. And that to me seems a little bit unfortunate sometimes, just because it seems like I'm causing that material to not have as much worm traffic due to the dryness, but sometimes it does seem like you gotta have a little bit of a trade-off. If you want to get the material a little bit more loose and flowing, it's got to dry, and by becoming dry, it just will, by its nature, become less prone to seeing worm activity. So I've got those top covering pieces of newspaper we could put back on here at the end, but I'd prefer to just leave these open because I do still have a to-do item that I'll need to do later once those retired top covering plastics had dried enough that I can shake what's stuck to them off. After I cut the camera, I will also make sure I've not stranded any worms out there, just to be sure, because that's one thing I wouldn't want to see happen. So, in other words, we're done. We're finished with the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.